Media outlets across the political spectrum are claiming that Representative Alexandria Ocasio Cortez made some giant gaffe when answering a question about China, Taiwan, and US involvement at the Munich Security Conference. But commentators are claiming that all of this media attention and outrage actually shows a sexist double standard in how AOC is treated compared to her male peers. At the center of this story is the question: was this even a gaffe at all, or are columnists making something out of nothing just to make AOC look bad? This story first got on my radar when I noticed people on Blue Sky were dunking on this tweet from Politico senior reporter Adam Wren. Adam Wren himself was quoting a New York Times article about AOC's appearance at the Munich Security Conference. And specifically, he pulled out this quote verbatim from the New York Times article. The New York Times wrote that Miss Ocasio Cortez said, "I think that this is such I think that this is of course a very longstanding policy of the United States." Before saying that the country should try to avoid reaching that point with China in the first place. And a lot of people highlighted this as a very intentional choice from the New York Times to include all of these parts of AOC's speech that sort of made it look like a flub. And interestingly enough, this seems to violate the New York Times' own editorial policy on quotations. So if we go to the New York Times' guidelines on integrity, its ethics policy that's publicly available, and we scroll down to quotations, there is a section here that says, "The writer should, of course, omit extraneous syllables like and may judiciously delete false starts. If any further omission is necessary, close the quotation, insert new attribution, and begin another quotation." So basically, this is suggesting that a quote like this shouldn't have happened. The quote should have started at, "This is, of course, a very long-standing policy of the United States." But instead, the New York Times chooses to include this false start and all of these ums and uhs, which, as a reporter myself, is a pretty unusual thing to do unless you're trying to frame the speaker as someone who doesn't know what she's talking about. Now, because of the backlash to this tweet, Adam Wren ended up deleting it, but he and the New York Times reporter Kellen Browning had this little back and forth on X about how people apparently didn't have reading comprehension. Because of the backlash to this tweet, Adam Wren ultimately deleted it, and he and New York Times reporter Kellen Browning had a little back and forth on X about how it was a good story, but people on social media lack reading comprehension. But these weren't the only two reporters at publications considered centrist or center left to highlight AOC's speech as some sort of apparent gaffe. If we look at the news tab of stories about AOC and her appearance at the Munich Security Conference, we see a slew of headlines indicating the same thing. And this Blue Sky user says, "I see they settled on a framing in the donor group chat." There's this opinion from the Washington Post called "AOC Tries Strategic Incomprehensibility." CBS News says AOC's Munich remarks about potential US troops in Taiwan draw criticism. The Hill says that JD Vance called AOC's response embarrassing. Bloomberg says watch AOC says US must avoid any such confrontation on Taiwan. Fox calls it a word salad. The National Desk reports critics pile on after AOC's Munich remarks. And Yahoo says AOC hit with social media backlash after appearing to struggle with question about US defending Taiwan. Lawyer Max Kennerly's take on this is deplorable state of US media on display here, deliberately misleading the public. You can literally type into Google the same question AOC was asked, and the AI will give you her same answer because strategic ambiguity has been official US policy her whole life. And here it is, the AI answer claiming, in response to would the US commit troops to defend Taiwan, it says whether the US would commit troops to defend Taiwan is officially governed by a policy of strategic ambiguity designed to deter both a Chinese invasion and Taiwanese independence. While the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act mandates providing defensive arms, it does not legally guarantee direct military intervention. So going back to what AOC actually said after we get through the false start and the ums, She replied, I think that this is I think that this is a very long-standing policy of the United States. True. And I think that what we are hoping for is that we want to make sure that we never get to that point. True. And we want to make sure we are moving in all of our economic, research, and our global positions to avoid any such confrontation and for that question to even arise. All true, all in line with the existing US policy on this issue. So, why do commentators have such a problem with AOC saying this? Well, as people on Blue Sky have surmised, quote, they do not want AOC to win, and they see this as an opportunity to knife her. In terms of AOC's near political future, there are questions on the rise of whether she's considering running for president or whether she's considering challenging Chuck Schumer for his seat in the Senate. And as of right now, publicly, she's not committing to either. She even said that her trip to the Munich Security Conference, which is unusual since it involves global policies versus domestic ones, is not a sign or an indicator that she's running for president. She actually said that it's offensive to refer to this as that type of strategic move because really what she was there to talk about was the rise of authoritarian governments around the world. And going back to the New York Times coverage of her trip, this is communicated clearly in the reporting if you read past the headline. AOC said to the New York Times, "This reporter came up to me and was like, 'Is Munich the new New Hampshire?' And I cannot say enough how out of touch and missing the point genuinely that is. Global democracies are on fire the world over, and established parties are falling to right wing populist movements." She added that she had not gone to Munich because I'm running for president, not because I've made some kind of decision about a horse race or a candidacy, but because we need to sound the alarm bells that a lot of those folks in nicely pressed suits in that room will not be there much longer if we do not do something about the runaway inequality that is fueling far right populist movements. And again, she's right. She argued that efforts to make clips of any 5 to 10-second thing from her remarks go viral online, especially in the conservative ecosystem, had been done to distract from the substance of what she was saying. And the New York Times continues on to report on the ground in Germany, the reaction to her visit seemed mostly positive at a time when many of the United States' traditional Western allies are alarmed by President Trump's hostility and are eager for an alternate approach. The mayor of Warsaw said he had been heartened by her visit and her eagerness to diagnose the causes of the recent surge of right wing populism, which was the subject of one of her panels. The mayor of Warsaw said, "It's of course refreshing to see some American politicians who talk openly about all of those challenges that we face. It's good to hear progressive voices which are courageous enough to call a spade a spade." The former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson, and a former head of a group of world leaders known as the Elders, said that AOC offered a generational freshness and that her left wing ideals appealed to Europeans. She said, "I'm not sure America's ready for that yet, but maybe it is." So, the takeaway from AOC's visit to Munich is that she did an incredible job. She said a lot of the right things. She was true in diagnosing the cause of right wing authoritarianism. She impressed European world leaders. She made strides where Trump has instead embarrassed the country. And all things considered, this should have been a positive slant on a positive visit. But instead, the mainstream media hyper fixated on ways to make her look immature, incomprehensible, unpopular, and like she didn't know what she was doing. And then after leading that coverage, MSN then turns around and blames it on conservatives who were destined to hate AOC and anything she said, anyways, because they view her entirely through a bad faith lens. The MSM can't blame this reaction on conservatives entirely because it's the MSM that was leading this coverage and framing it in this way. It is a distraction from the more serious issues that she's talking about, and it is totally unfair to frame her this way. But it's not surprising because AOC is a woman, she's a leftist, and she's a woman of color. And this is the type of treatment that members of these groups receive, not because they deserve it, but because the people framing the coverage have a bias against them. And we can see that very clearly in some of the commentary around her visit. For example, this is an opinion piece from Mediaite about AOC's supposed gaffe. The journalist takes what AOC actually said, which is, "This is a very longstanding policy of the United States." And then he says it's entirely unclear what AOC meant by this. But the closest thing he can surmise is that she previously said the United States would permit US troops to defend Taiwan in the case of an attack. Then the opinion writer goes on to say, wrong. America has for decades pursued a policy of, quote, strategic ambiguity, or not saying one way or another whether it will intervene militarily in such a conflict. So here we have this opinion writer completely editorializing and making up a convenient reason for his own argument around what he thinks AOC was implying. And he's saying she shouldn't have implied anything, but he's the one claiming that this is what she was implying. And besides, what she's saying is entirely the same thing as what he's saying. He's just twisting her words in the most bad faith argument possible to insist that this was some kind of gaffe. But it wasn't a gaffe. They're just claiming it was a gaffe. They're the ones turning it into a gaffe. Everyone else who was there at the time agreed with what she was saying. This is a media orchestrated narrative designed to undermine and attack AOC. And why might this opinion writer, Isaac Shore, be willing to construct this argument to undermine AOC? Well, if we look at his recent articles for the New York Post, we see that he has an extreme conservative slant. Specifically, if we scroll down, we see that in November 2025, he posted an article with the headline, Why So Many New Yorkers Were Swayed by the Lies of Socialism and Zohran Mamdani. Zohran Mamdani, currently the mayor of New York City and a Democratic socialist, is no stranger to this type of constructed media narrative meant to undermine him because his policies are too far left and people who are at the center don't like that. And some of those people at the center are journalists, and they use their position as journalists to manufacture these narratives, blame it on the right wing, but meanwhile, they're the ones pushing the narratives in the first place. And for AOC, this type of media treatment is amplified by the fact that she's not just a socialist, she's not just far left leaning, she's also a woman, and she's also a woman of color. And any woman who has experienced unfair treatment by the media or is cognizant of the way that the media treats women knows exactly what I'm talking about. It is a very subtle sort of manipulation, the kind that is completely wrapped in plausible deniability, so that it doesn't look like you're actually biased against AOC or biased against women in general. It's just a very convenient way to frame her as, again, unqualified, immature, embarrassing. It feeds directly into what Trump and JD Vance and the entire MAGA party want, but it is constructed by these supposedly neutral, unbiased sources who are actually carrying some pretty strong anti socialist sentiments that might be driving a lot of how they feel about AOC in this moment. And even if these people don't consider themselves sexist, even if they think they have no negative sentiment toward women and that they're totally unbiased toward women, they are literally rolling out a red carpet for some of the most vile misogyny on the right. Because who identified this as a gaffe and a misstep and a poor way to speak at the highest establishment level? Places like the New York Times did that. Yes, conservative influencers also did that, but the New York Times was right there along with them. And now we have Trump dragging AOC for this entirely artificially constructed narrative about a gaffe in Munich. And at the same time, he's referring to her as a young, attractive woman. So there you have the very clear cut, undeniable sexism that we've come to expect from Donald Trump. But lest we forget all the stepping stones that allowed Trump to do these types of things along the way. And are we going to see New York Times headlines about how sexist Donald Trump is? No, we're not. These types of criticisms operate in one direction. Democrats, and particularly socialist Democrats, endure the strictest of criticisms, while people on the right who have actual gaffes on a day to day basis, who are actually doing deplorable things, who are embarrassing America on the world stage, who are devastating America for people who actually live here, those people get away with it. But AOC is the one who's taken to task. And here's a great example of this type of media bias in action. We have Judd Legume, an independent journalist, writing about how a sitting congressman and a candidate for the US Senate ran a campaign ad declaring it's not a sin to be white, which is a variation of a notorious white nationalist slogan. And as Judd points out, the mainstream media was crickets on this. He was the first to report. He said the AP had zero mention of this, the New York Times had zero mention of this, the Washington Post had zero mention of this, Reuters, Politico, Axios, zero mention of this. Quote tweet, but AOC said, We have to focus our attention on the fact that AOC said multiple times, even though that goes against our own editorial policy on quoting figures. This is exactly what women running for office have to deal with at every level. Even the people who are supposed to be neutral and unbiased, even the people who are supposed to be on your side, are often the ones laying the groundwork for the most vile attacks against you from your opponents. This is what the media does time and time again to high profile women. They make it impossible for high profile women to exist and to succeed by hyperfixating on every perceived flaw and inventing flaws when there are no flaws to criticize. AOC is one of the most popular, one of the most talented, and one of the most prolific politicians of her generation and in the entire United States right now. Whether you like her or not, those are undeniable facts. And so it makes sense for her to have higher political ambitions. She is well suited for a run for the Senate or even for a run for the White House. But this is the type of treatment that women in her position receive. And even before she announces any sort of run, she's already facing these enormous odds. But you know what I actually am heartened by? I'm heartened by the fact that all of these various voices in the media, they aren't getting away with it. People in the audience are calling this out for what it is. They do not want to do this a third time. There are extremely valid criticisms of a lot of women who run for office, and those don't need to be silenced. But what we don't need to see are these false equivalencies, these manufactured controversies, and these just attempts to single out these women for gaffes that didn't even happen. That's what people are upset about. And the more that we see people refusing to tolerate this, the more progress I suspect we will see for these female candidates. We need more women in office. We need gender equality at every level. It is critical for all of our democratic functions to survive and thrive. And so these people are not going to let this stand in the way of AOC's potential run for higher positions of office. And I hope that people don't let it stand in the way of any women pursuing these types of goals and ambitions. Women running for office deserve to be treated fairly and equally to their male peers. But too often we see the opposite happen. We see this hyperfiction on women's perceived flaws while men like Donald Trump get away with seemingly anything. And people have had enough. We are at a breaking point. I find that to be a very optimistic view moving forward. And my only hope is that the media catches up before it gets run out of town.